John Keppie, architect, was a well-connected man. Few earthquakes occurred in the Glasgow creative world without his knowledge. So, when he heard of a student causing seismic ripples at art school night classes, Keppie went along to see for himself. He dropped by at the McClellan Galleries one evening, the Rose Street entrance, climbed the stairs, ran an eye over the designs this brash young talent was turning out, and offered him a job. The student's name was Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And so began a business relationship lasting 25 years, a quarter century of both friendship and fireworks, partnership and perplexity, some mistrust, but plenty mutual benefits. John Keppie was born at Prestwick in 1861 to a family of tobacco trade wealth, schooled at Ayr Academy and determined to become an architect. To further this goal, after Glasgow University, he spent time in Paris, as did many of the Glasgow boys, his direct contemporaries and friends. Edward Hurnell and Keppie attended Atelier Pascal, one of the studios where young men only at this point, could learn their trade from the French masters of the day. And learn he did. Keppie's sketches and watercolours were terrific, even at a time when the quality of draftsmanship was at its peak. Keppie will also have been schooled in life study, which involved depicting models, sometimes of the naked variety, both male and female. This may have taken a bit of getting used to for a young man more accustomed to the bracing pleasures of hacking round windswept golf courses in Ayrshire than he was to the sensual temptations of the feminine form. Golf was a big thing for Keppie, and Keppie was a big man. He won the title of Glasgow long driving champion year after year. And with a brisk but affable nature, his playing partners looked no further when in their own various fields, medicine, public works, industry, they found themselves in need of a capable architect. It was his medical contacts which had seen Keppie himself headhunted a few years previously. See, he'd got a start with the firm of Campbell, Douglas and Sellers, working on plans for the Glasgow International Exhibition of 1888. The bulbous onion domes, which may well have emerged from Keppie's studies of Moorish design in Paris, gave rise to the nickname Baghdad on the Kelvin. He also assisted with the Victoria Infirmary, presently being turned into flats, where the spacious wards and generous balconies helped it gain a reputation as that curious thing, a hospital where people often got better. There also, they installed an early form of air conditioning with ice blocks and steam coils to control temperature and humidity, and giant fans procured from far off Chicago. So while Keppie's work can be viewed as variations on existing styles, he was no enemy of innovation. But on the death of Sellers, another architect was promoted above him. So Keppie, seeing his way forward now blocked, jumped ship when John Honeyman came looking for a partner to join his own practice. Honeyman was an older architect who specialised in churches. After the Great Disruption of 1843, when more than 400 ministers marched out of the General Assembly in high dudgeon, Honeyman had made a fine career, supplying many of the new buildings 400 suddenly pulpitless ministers needed. Then there was the restoration of historic abbeys, such as Iona, and the lucrative business of installing central heating into any number of damp and chilly old kirks. Honeyman had done very well, but he was nearing 60, and he needed a younger man's energy to drive the firm forward. John Keppie was 27. He brought with him the contract for the Anderson Medical School, and very soon he had the Fairfields shipbuilding office block on the drawing board too, presenting its frontage to Govan in a composed classical style, not too extravagant, the central temple imposing rather than showy, but with the flourish of two fine statues by James Pitendry McGilvray, a sculptor friend of Keppie's. Riding high on their little prows over softly uncurling wavelets, the shipwright and the engineer, showing the high purpose and nobility of their crafts, should the actual workers on their way into the yard ever feel their inspiration failing as they clocked on for a shift in the drizzle of a winter dawn. The Fairfields job was on the books when Mackintosh joined the firm in 1889, as was Gailston Hall, Cardross on the way to Helensburgh. Now, you would expect the office junior to be given just the donkey work, the drainage, the downpipes, but we find here in the detail the unmistakable curvaceous caprice of CRM. The chimney, with its base blocks turned agley for no more reason than Charles thought it looked good, and the roof light, the antidote to sombre Victorian interior gloom, which Charles was to use repeatedly. But while the young man was blessed with outrageous gifts, he still had to master the technical aspects of construction before he could fully loose his imagination. So at this point, it would be safe to say that Charles was greedily absorbing whatever Keppie could teach him. Meanwhile, in his own time, Mackintosh painted this symbolic dream, the harvest moon. Things must have been cordial between the boss and the boy at this point, as Charles gave it to Keppie as a present. It hung in his office 40 years, despite the possibility that the fairy, saved from nudity only by the chance drifts of her flowing hair, it may have been modelled on Keppie's youngest sister, Jessie. To work up competition designs, Keppie would ask his office juniors down to his holiday home at Dunure, just south of Culzean. And while tough, concentrated graft was involved, Keppie did furnish a good table of victuals and allowed access to his fine wine cellar. Further, on Friday afternoons, after a week of primping at plans, who came down on the train from Glasgow to join the lads? The art school girls. Jessie Keppie and her pals from day lessons at the McClellan. Only men who had to work for a living, like Mackintosh, went in the evening. These girls came from rich West End families, had all the advantages of good breeding, and consequently liked nothing better than to cackle with laughter, spout wild ideas, drink Keppie's whisky, and flirt with his rough but handsome office staff. Byers Road revolutionaries. But Jessie and Charles became an item. They may have even, it was whispered, when the others were in their beds, have gone sketching together by moonlight. It was most likely Keppie himself who took these pictures of the gang larking about, setting the camera and dashing round to get into the shot. The girls, one of whom is of course Margaret MacDonald, called themselves the Immortals. The folly of that youthful hubris slips to pathos as we gaze into the lost past, evoked by these grey-scale photos. Keppie and Mackintosh worked closely together on the Conservative Club in Helensburgh. There's a bit of Keppie, keeping the customers happy with a relief of St Andrew. And here's some Mackintosh, pleasing himself with his growing library of sensual abstractions. And Keppie granted him even more freedom on the Glasgow Herald building. Charles getting sexy with swirling undulations in the sandstone. And the Canal Boatmen's Institute, demolished, I'm afraid, to make way for the ever-hungry M8. Here, to Keppie's sober refuge from the wickedness of the world, Mackintosh added a clock face, louping with saucy, buxom nudes. Questions may have been asked about the seriousness of the younger man's approach, and also whether this flippancy extended to his intentions towards Jessie. John Keppie's father had died in 1899, and he took his new role as head of the family in earnest. And knowing exactly what his sister's beau was earning, it appears that Keppie refused to allow the pair to marry, until at least Charles could begin to support her in the style, etc., etc. Jessie wrote a story for the Art School magazine at this time, in which a cruel king thwarted the romance between two young lovers. A veiled protest? But even if he wasn't minded to solve the problem by raising Charles's pay, Keppie was not holding him back professionally. Friendly with Francis Newbery, the director of the art school, the two were quite possibly in cahoots to get Mackintosh's designs accepted for this tricky but prestigious project on the steep drumlin of Garnet Hill. Meanwhile, Charles' work was attracting attention in Europe, his drawings published in Munich and Vienna. Charles railed against having to send these images with not his own signature on them, but the name of the firm, Honeyman and Keppie. But this was a custom of the day, and not a personal slight against Charles. The opening ceremony of the art school, to our modern eyes, does look a little bit shabbier. On a dreich December morn, John Keppie sat proud amongst the platform party, accepting the plaudits of Sir this hyphen that and Colonel so-and-so. And meanwhile Charles, who had done all the work, had to kick his heels in the Renfrew Street puddles down below. As an unintended consequence of Keppie's stalling of marriage for Charles and Jessie, Margaret MacDonald, tall, flame-haired, beautiful, lavishly talented, and possessed of a fine, questing imagination, began to fascinate Charles more and more. And more. I can't help suspect that the atmosphere at the Keppie office must have been decidedly frosty after Mackintosh broke off relations with Jessie and announced himself engaged to Margaret. Perhaps Keppie never fully forgave him. Nonetheless, knowing good business when he saw it, Keppie continued to bring in new contracts for his star draftsmen. Queen's Cross Church, Scotland Street School, and Charles' introductions to his own great patrons, Walter Blackie, Kate Cranston, William Davidson, can all be traced back to Keppie's web of connections. If he didn't know someone through the golf club, he'll have met them at the City Improvement Trust or the Sewage Works Committee. See, Keppie, he was one of those Victorians keen to see the vast new wealth of the city diverted to make the lot of the common man better. And he also spent plenty time at the art club in Bath Street, a buzzing centre of business lunch activity, securing the gallery for Charles to build, and eventually becoming president himself. the club was popular enough to attract celebrity visitors to Glasgow. Bram Stoker, Edwin Lutyens, Neil Monroe of course, and even Buffalo Bill. There is a juicy rumour that when Mackintosh tried to join the art club, Keppie blackballed his own employee's application. Maybe he's still peeved about him, jilting his sister? Can't be proved. Charles never did join the club though. But it's more likely, not being particularly gregarious himself, that he decided to let the clubbable Keppie deal with the influential old fuddy-duddies he was so expert at cultivating. What with all his various interests, John Keppie never quite got around to getting married. He did propose to Helen Law when he was 28, but she, I'm afraid, turned him down in favour of Edward Walton, one of the Glasgow boy painters. And later Keppie was quite taken with a lady artist, Bessie McNichol. This is her work. Now we can't be sure that John asked Bessie for her hand in holy matrimony, but we do know that he definitely did invite her to go cycling with him. She mentions it in a letter. Also, that she'd purchased a pair of flowing trousers for such activities, which looked like a skirt, but were in fact split up so far, in which Bessie preens, I look quite the scorcher when I dance the hornpipe. But I'm afraid to say, this vivacious girl was not to be Mrs. Keppie either. Covering Honeyman's continuing church work throughout the 1890s, St Michael's, Linlithgow, and the Bell Tower at Prestwick, amongst many others, Keppie pressed on into the new century by promoting Mackintosh to partner in the firm, thus letting him pursue the avant-garde projects which made his name. Keppie himself produced the McConnell Building, opposite the Theatre Royal, the Parkhead Savings Bank, both with apartments over the commercial premises and flat-roofed areas for drying clothes high above the dirt and smog. Then, riding on hard where other firms fell in the recession after 1909, which was caused by taxes in the Lloyd George budget, Keppie promoted Graham Henderson when Charles left to, unsuccessfully, set up on his own. Construction of Jordan Hill School took a pause for 5 years when war broke out, but Keppie found work, building premises in Bridgeton and East Kilbride for Maver and Coulson, the inventors of the alternating current dynamo, an essential component of the Admiralty's new warships. So, what sort of person was Keppie? Well, most of what we know of him is his reflection in the shining mirror of Mackintosh. The Glasgow art world was a smallish scene. Everyone lived and worked within walking distance of each other between Byres Road and Bath Street, so few letters were ever exchanged between its luminaries. And we do hear of King John, as he was later known, sitting in a prominent chair at the art club, giving the benefit of his opinion to those who passed. David Whitey, who won the competition to design the Mitchell Library, of which Keppie was the judge, David Whitey said that whenever he bumped into Keppie, he would maintain that the winning plans had been so good, it hadn't occurred to him that they could have been done by Whitey. Which is a compliment, sort of, and humorous, if you don't mind your jokes coming with big, heavy Scottish barbs hanging off them. He's been one of the lads, though, has Keppie. Recalling a voyage to France together, his pal Gregson remembers the shipboard food as particularly foul and greasy. So at Cardiff, him and Keppie took on their own supplies. Biscuits, a lobster, some lemons, and 2 tins of tongue. Odd, but reasonably extravagant. And then Keppie, from his previous time in France, managed to haggle them cheap lodgings with a landlady he knew, so he could be canny with his coins then too. Bernard Schatz, the sculptor, went sketching in the countryside with John every Saturday for years, and he remembers the precision with which Keppie kept tally of exactly whose turn it was to pay for tea and scones on the way home. And then again, Keppie was generous enough to send Charles a substantial payment for work on Jordan Hill School, long after he'd left the partnership. John Keppie was not a fellow in a rush to follow fashion. When the world went mad for Art Nouveau, he kept his classic roots, and neither did he enslave himself to the angles and darts of Art Deco, or to austere Bauhaus modernism when that came along in the 1920s. He didn't ignore the fads of the days and decades, but after 40 years in the business, the difference between this and this is surely just a matter of simplification. Stripping the basic good idea back to first principles. The columns and the capitals are still there. They're just flatter and less ostentatious. Steel structure has taken away the need for visibly weighty stone, but the visual prompts to make us realise that we are entering a place of dignity, order, and aspiration are still just as important to John. He continued with his Victorian ideals 45 years into the new century. Dying at the Prestwick family home, Jessie was with him. She hadn't married either. After her breakup with Mackintosh, brother and sister lived together to the end of their days. She does seem to have forgiven Charles, though. At the memorial exhibition, after his death in 1928, Jessie bought a painting by her former love. Faded flowers, a nightmare, time-ruined blooms. And as they left, she was heard bewailing the way Mackintosh's career had drifted after he set up on his own, chivying at her brother. "You should have done more to keep him with you." "What could I do?" Keppie replied. He wanted to go. Some would cast John Keppie as the villain in the Mackintosh story, the dead hand of convention, crushing the sparky genius. I say no. It was Keppie's outgoing, industrious nature which brought in the opportunities for Charles. And, of course, those which Keppie chose to keep for himself. John Keppie's work is a treasure of Glasgow.